All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for attending this Unlearn Week session. We have some really exciting guests to introduce you to. Before we do that, they do have a sign-up sheet, so if you haven't signed up, make sure you sign up. They brought amazing stuff in the back, so on your way out, make sure you grab that. There is a QR code for feedback for the group that is going to be presenting, and then there's also for your Unlearn Week attendance, there's a QR code on the door. Make sure you fill that out as well so that you can, so we can log your attendance, so you can earn your shirt, okay? So I would love to introduce you to Brandon Davis. I'm gonna turn it over to him. Give him a big hand.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Brandon Davis. I serve as the Managing Director of the City's Office of Oversight and Public Accountability, as well as the Office of Equity and Engagement. I'm super excited to be here today to be able to talk to you all. Thank you all for coming. I've actually been paying attention to what's been going on with Unlearn Week. It's been some super cool stuff. I saw a little bit of the Juneteenth presentation. Like, y'all doing some good stuff here at Calvin. So I'm excited to be able to be a part of that. So this is a presentation we do about knowing your rights and responsibilities. I am extremely passionate about the intersection between faith and justice. And I'll tell you that normally when I give this presentation, I don't talk about that part of it, but it is a passion place for me. So I'm an attorney by background. I went to Central Michigan University for undergrad and then Wayne State for law school. Began my career as in a defense role for a short time and then became a prosecutor in the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, which is in Detroit. Long story short, on my first day of work, they gave me a stack of files and said, go do your job. Right? And they sent me to a felony courtroom with a stack of files. Great learning experience, but it was definitely trial by fire. So after doing that for a few years, I was hired in Muskegon County, which is what brought me to West Michigan. And I began working as a senior assistant prosecuting attorney in Muskegon County, trying primarily murder cases and criminal sexual conduct cases. So if you could think of the most serious cases that we have in the state of Michigan, that's what I was doing. So gained a lot of experience in that space as well. I was later recruited to the city of Grand Rapids to work for the city in the labor relations department. After getting there, the city manager very quickly wanted an office of oversight and public accountability. And because my background was both criminal law, and then I also had that employment law from working in labor relations, it was like the perfect merger, right? So that's what brings me before you today. Then the faith part, I also serve as an executive pastor at the Church of the Living God, which is in Muskegon, Michigan. So that's that intersectionality. So when I approach these conversations, especially here today, I hope it's okay if we approach it with both of those things in mind. This isn't clicking. Listen. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about what is OPA. In the interest of time, we'll spend a little bit on the icebreaker, but I really want to spend some time talking to you about what to do if you're stopped on the street in your car or if there's a visit to your home. I want to talk about the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment. I am into interactive conversation, so if y'all got questions, go ahead and throw your hands up and we'll make it work. Sound good for everyone? I can't hear y'all. You know, sound good there? Right? There we go. Let's do it. All right. So the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability, again, was founded back in 2019. The goal overall is to build bridges to trust between public safety and community. The way I usually talk about this is by explaining the fact that you can't build anything on a rocky foundation, right? So if you want to have trust, it's just like a house. You're not going to go outside and build a house on top of a whole bunch of boulders, right? It just won't make sense. It won't be stable. So when we talk about our work at OPA, we don't talk about trust every day. We talk about clearing out that foundation because we can't ignore the history of what's happened in our country, right? It's a lot of great things that's happened, but it's a lot of really bad things that have happened as well. So when we talk about the history of policing in America, the very first type of policing in America was the slave patrol, where individuals were sent out to go find runaway slaves. That was the first type of policing in our country. So when we think about the history of it, we have had racism and systemic inequities embedded in the system from the very beginning, right? So part of the work we do in OPA is to work with community and work with our public safety department. So how do we fix this? How do we work through those spaces? So when we talk about our work, we talk about four main categories: change, accountability, restorative justice, and then empowerment and engagement. And because this is not the heart of our presentation, I'm gonna do it really quickly this time, right? But when we talk change, we're talking about policy. We're talking about the law and policy. So just like there is a history of inequities in our country, the laws that we live by, many of them have existed, I want to say for forever, but for a very long time, right? So because these laws have existed for such a long time, they existed when racism when racism was just out and proud, right? When it was okay to do racist things in our community, when it was no secret, and in some spaces when racism was legal. Some of those laws still existed during that time. So what we're doing is we're looking at those policies and we're looking at those laws and we're saying, do we need them now? That's the first question, right? And many times the answer is yes. These are laws that are necessary because other laws have been built on top of them, right? They're a framework for how we move. So then we say, how do we take this law and change it so that there are not systemic inequities, so there aren't disparate outcomes, right? So certain people aren't getting the bad end of a stick, for lack of a better term. How do we make changes? So when we talk about that change part, that's what we're talking about. Looking at the law, looking at the policies, and saying, how do we make change in that space? Then we talk accountability, we're talking about individual police officers or firefighters for the most part. So that's when you hear on the news that it's alleged that a police officer has done something wrong, right? Those individual cases, that's what we talk about when we're talking about accountability. Now, I can spend a lot of time talking about OPA's role in that space. It's not what most people think, but in the city of Grand Rapids, we have an internal affairs division. Our job is to help community navigate the complaint process. Then the complaints go to internal affairs, which means the police evaluate them. After that process, we then can do an audit on that and say, was this done fairly, right? That's it in a nutshell, a real quick nutshell. All right, so the next part is restorative justice, and this is the part I get excited about every single time. I love that our office does this. This is when we say there's been so much harm that has been caused by the criminal justice system, and somebody needs to do something about it. The most classic example of that is the war on drugs. How many of you are familiar with the war on drugs? So when we talk about the war on drugs, what we're talking about is there was a time in American history, I want to say I was probably like 12 when this was happening, right? So not that I'm not that old, right? So it wasn't that long ago. But there was a time in American history where what was happening was we had this major assault on drugs. So really what was happening was the U.S. government was targeting Black and brown communities, primarily Black communities, and saying, we're going to arrest individuals for the use or the sale of drugs. Now, historically, many historians will suggest that those drugs got into those Black communities by the same government or many of the same government officials who are now prosecuting them because of it, right? But what it did was it created a system where now there were inequities in every space, because once you get felonies, you can't get jobs in many spaces, right? Or then it's more difficult to get housing. And then if you can't get housing, you can't take care of your children and your children get taken away. So now your children are in the system, and it created this system, right? So when we talk about restorative justice, we're talking about those things, those root issues. How do we address it? So some of the things we do is we have an expungement program, and that program is a free service where we help people clear their criminal records in order to be able to become productive members of community. We help them work through those types of spaces, and we can talk more about that, but again, because of time, I'm gonna move real fast, okay? The next one is empowerment and engagement. And this is where we do stuff like what we're doing today, where we come out and we speak to community and we say, we want you to understand your rights. We want you to understand your responsibilities. I usually use this example, so I'll do it with you. Who has ever watched a viral video of an officer-involved shooting and heard the words, "Stop resisting"? Right? Now, just about every officer-involved shooting that you'll watch from around the country, you'll usually hear an officer saying, "Stop resisting, stop resisting." I gotta be real with y'all. When I don't really enjoy watching these videos, right? Like I pretty much only watch them if they're connected to work. But I'll tell you that my family watch them. So if I'm at my mama's house and we all sitting around the TV and it's time, and we're watching one of those, you'll hear the officer saying, "Stop resisting, stop resisting." And you'll hear my mama and my grandma, they'll say, "He not resisting." He doesn't, they screaming at the TV. They having a time with the TV. He is not resisting. He's not resisting. And the legal definition and the common sense definition of resisting and obstructing a police officer are different. So let's talk about that. So the common sense definition, most of us think of resisting as like running away from an officer, right? Or physically assaulting an officer. And those things are resisting and obstructing. That's part of it, but that's not all of it, right? So one of the things in Michigan law, it says that if an officer gives you a lawful order, whether or not you knew it to be lawful, and you fail to obey that order, that is resisting and obstructing a police officer. And it's punishable as a felony with up to 2 years in prison. Here's the reason I share this story. Who's teaching us that? Right? Who's teaching the average person that information so that they know, oh wait, he told me to put my hands up and I didn't put my hands up immediately. I'm resisting. They're thinking I'm being compliant, but I'm trying to figure out what's happening. Right? Like you can see the confusion on some of these videos on people's faces. The officer's saying put their hands up and they're standing like this saying, why do I need to put my hands up? No, tell me what's happening. The whole time they're doing that, they're violating the law unknowingly. Right? So part of what we do in this space is say, we understand that there aren't a lot of people teaching this. There are some people doing really good work in that space. But we want to make sure that we're a part of that solution. Not only does that lead to officer safety, which is important, but it leads to safety for community members. And it helps community members make informed decisions when they find themselves in these positions. They're not just out thinking that they understand what's happening because TV makes it seem one way, right? Like when I was a courtroom prosecutor, I used to always use this example and I would ask I might date myself age-wise, y'all, but I would ask, who likes CSI or who likes Law and Order, right? Some of those shows, I don't even know what the new court shows are, right? And I would always ask the jury, I'd say, but you understand that you can't hold me to that TV burden of proof, right? Because on TV, somehow by the end of the show, they would run in with the last little piece of evidence. It'd be a footprint from 20 years ago. The dirt is found on the bottom of somebody's shoe. You're able to test it and sample it and come in with everything right there. And that's what people think real life is. So we learn so much of what the law is by watching court shows or by listening to what somebody else told us. And the truth is, we need to make sure that we're empowering ourselves by learning what the real law is, right? Okay. So that's what OPA does. And let's do this. So our opening exercise, I'm just going to ask two people to do it in the interest of time. If you would tell me, what's your overall experience with police? When you think of police, what's your experience? Anybody? I like it. Go ahead.
Not much really at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of looking at both. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that yet, but I was looking
Do
at
you
the
think?
other experience, the other question, because I grew up in Flushing, Michigan. I don't know if you're familiar with the area, but I did a lot of my school in Flint.
Okay.
So we had I had two very different views of
Yes.
police in
Uh-huh.
the two communities I was really involved in. Because Flushing was
Pro-police. Yeah.
Police, yeah. And in Flint it was just bad experiences all around.
Yeah.
So,
No, I appreciate you sharing your experience. Anybody else want to share? Okay, and that's okay. Let me share mine. So I grew up on the west side of Detroit, right? And this is a true story. Every time I share it, I have to say it's a true story because it sounds like I'm putting on for myself. But it was one Wednesday night I was leaving Bible class, and that's the part people don't ever believe. But I was really leaving Bible class. And I had a young lady in the car with me, and I was dropping her off. And so I'm driving down, it was a side street. Long story short, 3 police cars pull up around me. And I was driving a white Ford Taurus. There was nothing special about my car, nothing that would, but 3 cars pull up around me. Of course, I'm super scared, right? They pull me out the car, throw me on the hood, rough me up. And afterwards, and I also always want to add that these were black officers, right? Because I think there's a perception that some of the stuff that happens with policing is all based off of it was a white officer with a black person. That's not always the case. These were black officers who pulled me out the car, threw me on the hood of the car and roughed me up. And afterwards, they said you fit the description of a bank robber. Now, the area I was in, I don't know what bank I could have robbed, first of all, right? But I was 16 years old, literally had my Bible sitting in the backseat of the car, right? And it was one of the experiences that completely shaped my life from that point forward. But it's not just such a unique story. My brother had a very similar experience, and it's funny to mention for him too. He actually, our church that we grew up in was right across the street from a gas station. And he had walked across the street doing service to the gas station. And officers stopped him and tackled him and took him to the ground, right? These were real experiences that we have had. And I gotta be honest with you, those are the type of experiences I had with police growing up. Once I became an attorney, I had very different experiences with police officers. I have a great respect for many of the officers that I've worked with who are great individuals and they're doing this for the right reason. We point that out though because we want people to understand that there are very different experiences and very different realities that people face. And knowing your rights and responsibilities helps you navigate those spaces in a better way. So let's talk about some of those things. So at the end of the day, the first thing to know is that every person has rights in this country. It's not about citizenship status or anything like that. You have rights. Our Constitution gives rights to everyone who steps foot on American soil. So we want to talk about what you do if you're stopped in your car. We'll probably spend the most time on that. We also want to talk about if an officer stops you on the street, and also talk about if an officer comes to your home. Now here's what we're doing. We're giving you information so you can make informed decisions. At the end of the day, it's not my responsibility to tell you what to do. I'll tell you what I would do. And I'll also tell you what the law is. But you make your own decisions based off of that information. Is that fair? Okay. So, a couple of things that you want to understand, a couple of terms. The first is probable cause. Now, the way I explain probable cause for the short version, so when I would meet with victims before a case, and I got like 1 minute before the judge is going to call the case, I'd be like, all right, we're here at a probable cause hearing. That's basically like a strong maybe. That's the easiest way to describe probable cause. It's a strong maybe. It's more than just a little guess, right? There's evidence to support it, but it's not quite the same as beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest standard in the law. So, example here, it requires sufficient evidence of a crime. Law enforcement must believe that a crime has been or will be committed. An example of this would be like, if an officer observed a red light violation, so they pull over a car, and then they smell alcohol on somebody's breath. That'll give them probable cause to investigate the drunk driving. That makes sense, right? Or another way to talk about that, we could talk about it under the frame reasonable suspicion, but we won't do that right now. The next one is reasonable suspicion. So that allows a brief stop to investigate some type of criminal activity. So that's like a quick stop, right? Officers must have a specific, articulable belief of that wrongdoing. So if a classic example is like a case, it's called a Terry stop, or a Terry pat down. And if anybody's interested in the law, I will guess because y'all hear somebody probably is. But if anybody's interested in the law, you'll hear a lot about this in law school. But the idea behind it is you could do a brief detention or a brief touching or a brief pat down in order to see if like there's some type of contraband if you have a reasonable suspicion. So you saw somebody take what looked like a gun and shove it in their pants, right? Like you're not exactly sure it was a gun, but then you see the bulge, you see them acting weird, all that type of stuff. You probably could do a quick pat down to check for officer safety. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. And lastly is the hunch. This is not a legal basis, right? And until those TV shows I talked to you about, people talked about those, I got a hunch, right? Or I had my pastor at home, he would say, I got a sneaky suspicion. That doesn't work, right? It has to be more than just a hunch. Any questions so far? All right. So the first thing we want you to understand is that there are lots of different police departments around our community, around this campus. There are lots of police departments. We work closely with the Grand Rapids Police Department, but then you also have Wyoming Police, you have Kentwood Police, and each city has their own ordinances. So that means laws can be slightly different from place to place of what's allowed and what's not allowed. At the state level, obviously we got the same laws for the state of Michigan. So those are your major crimes, your felony crimes. But some of those smaller misdemeanor crimes, something might be legal in the city of Grand Rapids, but not legal in the city of Kentwood. So you have to understand those differences. Or like noise violations. This is applicable to college students, right? Like noise violations in the city of Grand Rapids will be likely treated differently than in Kentwood or in Walker because the laws are different. That makes sense to everybody? Okay. So, if you are stopped by the police, what do you do? Number one, stop your car in a safe place as soon as possible. Now, a safe place doesn't mean you get to drive until you feel comfortable stopping. Which some people, that's how they describe it. Well, I just didn't feel comfortable stopping on the freeway. Well, that's not how this works, right? You have to stop. When we say a safe place, what we mean is you don't just stop in the middle of traffic with a car right behind you. You want to get to the right side or to the left side. I know this seems common sense for you all, but you'll be surprised how many people we interact with, and those are some of the things we say, or that we hear them say. The next thing is you stay in your car. And again, this is something that we've learned recently with our immigrant and refugee community members, is that in different countries, the laws are not the same. And it's something that I most certainly took for granted, having grown up in America forever. I didn't even consider that this could be different, but the truth is, it is different places. Some places the expectation is to get out of the car in order to show respect and to keep the officer safe, that you're not going to run and all those types of things. That is not the law or the expectation here. Everybody understand that? Okay. The next thing you want to do is keep your hands visible at all times. Now, when we give these speeches or these presentations, I'm pretty transparent about my experience. And I think it's just important for us to confront the fact that the experience for Black and brown people is different than it is for white people in America. So when I was growing up, my mother gave us what we call the talk. And the talk was, when you're stopped by the police, it's different for you. That's a tough conversation for parents to have. The truth is, I had the same conversation with my daughters when they started driving. And the difference is because of the history of this country, because of the villainization of Black and brown people historically, there are unconscious biases that impact everybody, right? That doesn't make somebody a bad person. That doesn't mean that they're not trying to do the right thing. That doesn't mean that they don't want to serve justice appropriately, but our unconscious biases impact how we move. Sometimes those are the things that make us cross the street when we see certain people near us, right? And to us, we're like, oh, I'm just trying to be safe. I felt uncomfortable. But then we question the why we felt uncomfortable, right? And when we get down to the root of the why we felt uncomfortable, sometimes it's because of what we've seen on TV about certain races of people or certain demographics, certain ages. Those are the types of things we think about. So that talk taught us to keep our hands up at all times so officers can see them. So like when I am pulled over by an officer and they say, where's your registration? I say, I am reaching for my registration, which is in my glove box, right? Because that's how I was taught to do it. But the big thing is to keep your hands clear at all times. You want officers to be able to see that you're not reaching for a weapon or anything like that. It's also important that we talk about this from an officer's perspective. They're walking up to a vehicle, they don't know what's happening in that car, right? Now they're trained professionals, they should behave like trained professionals, but they're still human. And they're walking up to a space that they don't know what's happening, right? So part of what we're doing is, as community members, is helping them to also feel safe in that space. So when I think about it, again, this is how Brandon does it. But when I think about it from my perspective, I'm keeping my hands free, one, so that they know I'm not doing anything else, but also because I want them to feel comfortable. If they feel comfortable during this interaction, it's going to go better for both of us, right? So those are some of those things we can think about as we walk through it. You have to show your license, your registration, and proof of insurance when asked. The thing about this is, here's where we sometimes get messed up. A lot of times, because of this TV experience, CSI has messed a lot of people up, right? But because of this TV experience, you hear people saying, what are you pulling me over for? Why am I pulled over, right? And they will refuse to give a license or a registration or proof of insurance until they know why they were pulled over. Well, let me help you. That's not how the law works, right? That's just not how it is. Now, do I think officers should tell us why they're pulling us over? Yes. I think it will diffuse a lot if you explain what's happening. But they're not always at that space. And their failure to explain doesn't mean that you don't have to give your license, right? And then when you're ready to leave, you can ask if you're being detained or if you're free to go. So you want to ask the officer, if they say have a nice day, you're free to go, right? But there's times you could be sitting there and you're like, am I being detained? Can I leave? You want to ask that question to get clarity before you do anything different. Then lastly, document the interaction if you have any concerns about it. The way we teach this is we want you to understand that the scene of the crime or the scene of the stop is not the place to fight a stop. At the end of the day, what you want to do is remain safe, right? You want to remain safe. Your rights, you fight for your rights in court. On the scene, my choice, Brandon's choice, is to comply with whatever is being said. I think that's the best way to stay safe. Absent some clear, ridiculous, it's so obvious that I should not be doing this, right? I'm not gonna do something that I just know to be illegal. But if an officer is saying, get out the car, and legally I don't think they can order me out the car from it, even as an attorney, I'll say, are you ordering me to do that? If they respond and say yes, I'm gonna get out the car. But later on, please believe I'm gonna show up and I'm gonna fight regarding what happened, right? And we'll talk about some of that on these slides. So under the Fourth Amendment, when you are stopped in a car, you can refuse the search of your car unless the officer has probable cause or a search warrant by saying, I don't consent to this search. That does not mean the officer is not going to search the car, right? But what you're doing right there is you are making your voice clear. You're making it clear your position on this issue. I'm not consenting to your search, but that doesn't mean I'm not obeying what you said. Are we understanding the difference there? Again, because what's the rule? We can fight this later, right? So let's say an officer searches your car and they don't have probable cause to search your car. And they find something illegal in the vehicle. Let's say it's I know y'all sign those contracts, right? So y'all not doing this stuff at all. But let's say they found like a open alcohol container or something in a vehicle, right? Well, if the officer didn't have probable cause to search the car, later on, that piece of evidence can be suppressed in court, which means it wouldn't be able to be used in a case against you later. But again, that's only if you take those steps to protect your rights. Everybody understanding what I'm saying? Okay. So the next thing is the Fifth Amendment. You can refuse to answer questions beyond identifying yourself. So you have to identify yourself. What's your name, right? You have to give them your name. You have to provide your ID. But where are you going? You do not have to engage in conversation. And there are now I know we live in this West Michigan nice space, right? But there are respectful ways of saying that. Now, I really don't feel comfortable answering any additional questions. Thank you, though. Right? And now, I always explain in these conversations, the officers can take that one way or another. That might make an officer mad, right? And whereas they got a choice between giving you if you like me, we're on camera, let me tell the truth, though. If you like me, your foot might get a little heavy sometimes, right? So they have a choice there. They can show some discretion and give you a warning. They can give you a ticket. If you respond and saying, I don't want to answer your questions, they might be less likely to give you a warning. Again, they're human. That humanity comes into place, right? It comes into play. But you have the right to do that. And the purpose of today is to help you understand those rights, not to tell you what you have to do. All right. Next, if you're arrested, you can have an attorney present during all legal proceedings under your Sixth Amendment right. So again, you have a right to retain an attorney, which means purchase your own lawyer, right? Or you can also ask for a court-appointed lawyer, and that's based on your financial status. So the court won't just give you a public defender if you are, a multimillionaire. You'll be like, no, go get your lawyer. But if it's an indigent individual and they need that type of support, the court will supply it. Any questions about this slide? Awesome. So, what do you do if you're the passenger in the car, right? Yes, sir.
How effective is the law that is given to you by the lawyer that was given to you by the court and the lawyer that is hired alongside?
Yeah. The question was, how effective is a public defender as opposed to retained counsel? Truth. Now, I do some retained work, and I've also worked as a court-appointed lawyer. I was the same lawyer in both spaces, right? Like people, I wasn't a better lawyer. I'm not a better lawyer because I'm retained than I was when I was doing public defender work. And I think that's the truth for the vast majority of people. There are differences in terms of caseloads and things of that nature. It may feel different sometimes. Retained lawyers have incentives to maybe make you feel better about the process, right? Because they're being compensated differently. It's a different space. But I believe the vast majority of lawyers treat all of their clients the same without regard for whether they're retained or they're a public defender. Again, experience does make a difference. Sometimes you might get newer lawyers in the public defender's office early on in their career, right? Because they're learning, but that doesn't mean they're not a good lawyer, they're not representing you well. I think those are some myths that have been presented. And maybe there was a time in history where that was true. But I just don't think my experience says that's not the truth now. The public defenders I know work hard to do a good job for their clients. At the same time, the retained lawyers I know do too. Right? Okay, so when you're the passenger in the car, the first thing you want to do is start recording. Like that's what you can do, right? So you just sit. You don't have to be obnoxious about it, but you can have your phone in your hand and be recording. It's happening. Yes.
Do you need consent for recording?
You do not need consent. So in Michigan, you do not need consent to record interaction with a police officer. Now, again, on some tapes, you might hear people saying, "I'm not giving you consent to record me." And as a lawyer, I'm like, okay, right? Like you're in a public place. There's nothing that prevents me from recording this interaction. I think recording interaction is one of the best things you can do to protect yourself and protect the other people in that space. Now, again, it's one of those things. It's not required that you record every interaction with police. And again, I'm not trying to make it seem like police are bad. But if you want to be able to have some type of documentation of what occurred, that's the best way to do it. The next thing is, again, as a passenger, you have some rights too, as it relates to a search. Oftentimes, officers will say, "Can I search you?" And our natural reaction is to be like, yes, right? These are high stress situations. You want to be compliant and all this type of stuff. So if you say yes, even if the officer didn't have probable cause and they find something on you, they can use it because you consented to the search. Whereas if you say no, if they don't have probable cause, either they can't search you, or if they do search you without that probable cause, they should be suppressed in court. You understanding the difference? Yes? Okay. So again, you don't have to comply with a pat down. That doesn't mean they're not going to pat you down, right? When we say you don't have to comply, I actually think we should switch that word, Albert. You don't have to consent to that pat down, right? You don't have to consent to that pat down. I say comply with everything the officers are telling you to do in that space, but you want to be clear that you don't have to consent to all those spaces. You want to ask if you're free to leave before you leave the scene, right? So a driver may have to stay on the scene, but as a passenger, you might not have to. So if you feel uncomfortable or you want to leave and be in another space, you can ask the officer, "Am I free to leave?" Right? And then you can do what you need to do. You also have the right to remain silent. Best thing you can do to stay safe, though, is to stay calm. In these situations, it is natural for our emotions to rise. I never try to remove the humanity from it. They're scary situations. Some of us have experienced our own trauma, but for those of us who have not experienced our own trauma, there's vicarious trauma from the stories that have been passed down from generation to generation, or now with social media, right, from the videos we see every day that cause us to have different levels of fear. So that's how it works in those type of situations. Okay, so here's what we're gonna try to do it, y'all. I need a couple people. I need 2 volunteers. I'm gonna pick on some people. Yeah, I get 2 volunteers. Y'all want to do it? Y'all clap it up for my volunteers. Clap it up for my volunteers. All So y'all are, here's your role play. Take a seat. And you get to be the driver because you chose the left seat. Okay. All right. So here's how we do it. You're driving. I'm the police officer. I'm pulling you over. Right? All right. Woo! There we go. You can pull it over. Right? All right. Come up to the window. License, registration, and proof of insurance.
Okay, reaching for my license and registration, returning my boat apartment.
Yeah, clap it. Hold on, let's press pause. That was pretty good. That was good stuff. All right.
There you are, officer.
So thank you so much. I appreciate you handing me your license and registration, right? So now I got his license, registration, and his proof of insurance. What you doing over there, passenger?
I'm recording.
He's recording. Y'all clapping up for my passenger. Right? He's recording his interaction, but notice how he's doing it. He's not making a scene. He's not interrupting the officer who's doing his job, right? He's not doing anything like that. And up to this point, the officer hasn't done anything that's problematic. Everybody's doing what they're supposed to do in this situation, okay? Officer takes it back. I'll be right back, okay? Officer takes it back, runs it, comes back. Can I search your car?
Sure.
Okay, let's talk about that. He got the choice to say the officer can search his car, but he's not obligated
It's true.
to say the officer can search his car, right? So again, it's not wrong to say you're going to allow the officer to do it. That's okay. But you should know your rights. And your rights say that you don't have to allow it. Right? Now the officer says, get out the car. Notice he got out the car. Let's try it again. Now I'm going to try something different. Will you get out of the car for me?
Yes.
Okay. Choice though, right?
Yeah.
So notice what could have happened is, are you ordering me to get out the car? Right? Because if the officer, again, you don't have to do that. You didn't do anything wrong. But understand that for people when they are stopped by the police, if there is, the officer's job is to find evidence in that space. So when they're searching the vehicle, you can have a seat, thank you. When they're searching the vehicle, they're searching the vehicle looking for evidence. Looking for anything that may be illegal, right? So if it's an empty under a seat or something like, or whatever it is in a car, they can take it to another level. Again, we talk about our rights and responsibilities. We want you to make informed decisions. We are in no way telling you not to be compliant. What we are telling you is to understand the law and understand the consequences of that decision. Let's say the passenger then had something that he hid under the seat and you didn't know, right? And you say, officer, you can search the car. Now the officer searches the car and finds it. It's in the car. You know what I'm saying? Those are the types of things you want to be aware of. Again, this is not about not being compliant. It's about understanding. Okay. Y'all clap it up for the volunteers. Thank you. Okay. Go ahead.
Do they have to identify why they stop?
They do not. They do not. So that's a myth, right? It's a myth that every time you're stopped, the officer has to tell you why you were stopped. That is not the truth. Now, it makes sense for them to talk to you about why you were stopped. I think, Brandon's personal opinion, Brandonology, or, when I'm preaching, sometimes I say in the book of Brandon when I'm saying something that's just my thought process, right? But in the book of Brandon, I think it would de-escalate most situations if you have an understanding of what happened. It appeared to me that you were speeding, so I'm investigating that. Right? Now, that's not going to always de-escalate, because you can see people like, I wasn't speeding, right? Bad. And officers have to weigh that as well. Again, I try to make sure that people are understanding from an officer's perspective, they don't want to do anything that's going to amp it up either. And just like individual bad experiences have shaped my viewpoint, right? When I was pulled over by police, it made me more nervous about police. Some individual experiences of officers have probably shaped theirs too. Not excuses, but it's true when we talk about the humanity of these interactions. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So if police stop you on the street, these are similar, so I'm going to go fast so I can get to the law for y'all, okay? If police stop you on the street, what do you want to do? You want to comply? You want to remain calm and respectful? And when they stop you, you got to identify yourself. That's all you have to do, right? So let's say I'm just walking down the street and the officer says, stop. What's your name? My name is Brandon Davis. That's it. Where are you going? I really don't want to talk about that. Am I free to leave? If they say no, I'm going to stay there. If they say yes, I'm leaving, right? If they say no, and they keep you and they shouldn't have, what do we do? You fight it in court. So you can file a complaint with our office, right? You can file a complaint with our office regarding police officers' actions. OPA@grcity.us for any Grand Rapids police officer or firefighter. And then we'll help you through that process of fighting the violation. Or if you're eventually charged in a criminal case, you will fight that in court. But you don't fight on the scene. It does not help you and it does not help them, right? And the other part is, I often explain it like this. It took me 3 years and now 13 years of being 3 years in law school and 13 years of being an attorney to gather this level of understanding regarding these situations, right? And there are still times I need to go look it up and say, oh, that was kind of close. The risk of getting it wrong and then being able to be convicted of a felony outweighs, in my opinion, any level of satisfaction that I might get by checking it in a moment. That makes sense? Now, there's some things I'm completely sure of, but again, I've been a lawyer for 13 years. I might say something about one of those things that I'm completely sure of, but that's a different level of expertise, right? So you want to understand the difference, yes.
If they stop them and they're walking on the street, do they have to have identification on them?
So no, there's no law that says you have to have ID on you at all times. You have to have a license when you're driving, right? I believe it's wise to have ID on you at all times. Bible says wisdom is the principal thing, right? Like that's. I think it makes sense to always have, identification on you. But for you to have identification, it's not a crime when you're not driving, or there's not some other legal reason you have to have it. Okay, so if you're not free to leave and they say, "Can I search you?" You have a right to say yes or no. I'm going to say no, right? I'm not going to consent to a search. Again, they might search you. But if they search you and they shouldn't have, what do? That's right. We fight it later, right? We fight it later if you so choose. We're not fighting on the scene. It does not make sense to fight officers on the scene. That's not what you do. You're going to fight it in court or fight it in the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability or wherever else you need to deal with it. If they start asking you questions, where were you going? Did you just come out of this store? Now, for us, a lot of times it just feels like that's such a simple question I can just answer. Why wouldn't I? Sometimes I would hear people say stuff like, if you weren't guilty, you would just answer, right? But the truth is, the reason they have a Fifth Amendment is because anything you say or do will be used against you in a court of law, right? So there's direct evidence, which is somebody testifying to exactly what they saw or heard, and then there's circumstantial evidence, which is where you put the pieces together of stuff that happened. Yes.
You just quoted the Miranda laws, right?
Yes.
Now, if I'm stopped on the street, those laws apply to me even before they're declared to me?
So let's talk about what Miranda is.
Okay,
So I'm gonna do this part and then I'm gonna answer that part. Great question, and we get into every one of these sessions. So when we talk about, let's just do the Miranda part. So when we talk about Miranda law, right? So Miranda is anything you say or do will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to remain silent. All the stuff you see when somebody arrested on TV, right? They immediately go to all of. Yeah. You immediately go to the Miranda rights, and there's a misconception that Miranda is required for everything. It is not. So Miranda, do the rights apply? That you have the right to remain silent? Yes, because that's the Fifth Amendment, right? Anything you say or do can be used against you in a court of law. That's the truth, whether they say it to you or not. But what the Miranda is about, custodial interrogation. What that means is that when an officer says you cannot leave, or creates a situation where you're not free to leave, and they start asking you questions, this is a summary, but that's considered custodial interrogation in some spaces, right? So that's like me saying, you're like, am I free to leave? And they say no. And then they're like, what were you doing? Well, why did you have a gun? And you start answering all these questions. Well, and they didn't give you your Miranda warnings. Your lawyer can now argue to have that statement suppressed in court because they didn't give you your Miranda rights. It doesn't mean that they can't arrest you if you weren't given your Miranda rights, that the arrest is somehow invalid, right? Now, common practice and what should happen is they give you the rights. As soon as they arrest you, Because if you say something or they ask you a question, they wouldn't be able to use it. Does that make sense? Right. But the failure to give Miranda doesn't mean everything related to the case goes out the window. I can't tell you how many clients I've had who've been like, they didn't Mirandize me. This has got to go. I'm like, what in the world does that have to do with what we're talking about? But to them, it seems like it, right? Like, because that's what we understand from law and order. But y'all not holding me to a law and order burden, right? So that's the difference. Everybody understanding what I'm saying? Okay, great question. Great question. And the last thing is, if you're arrested, you want to assert your Fifth Amendment right to an attorney. If asked, yes, you want a lawyer. When I was in law school, my criminal law professor, one of the things he said that has always stuck out against me is that any lawyer who chooses to represent himself has a fool for a client, right? And it always stuck out to me. Even lawyers should have a lawyer if they find themselves in this type of situation. It is not wise for you to walk in and decide, I'm going to represent myself. Because I guarantee you, no matter how smart you are, if you stand against me in a courtroom, we're going to have a time. You know, we're going to have a time. And that's just based off of my experience doing it. Right? That makes sense?
I have one more question.
Oh,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
I have so many. I'm Pakistani,
Okay.
right? So there was a time where there's like, you as a Pakistani person might actually not have a right to an attorney because of the Patriot Act.
Mm-hmm.
Is that still a thing?
You know, that's a little bit beyond
Okay,
my
we're
level
talking about
of what it is. I'm not an immigration expert, so
Okay.
I don't want to, you know.
I mean, I'm an American citizen.
No, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. What I'm saying is I'm not an immigration expert, so there's some places where immigration law interacts with the criminal justice system that makes some spaces a little less clear, but as it relates to being in a criminal courtroom, yes, you still have a right to an attorney. There's other types of spaces and hearings in the immigration space that are different, but if it is a crime that can be punishable with any type of incarceration, you're entitled to a lawyer. Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
No problem. No, this is for it. Okay, so we don't have a whole lot of time left, so I'm gonna do this part real quick for y'all, right? So I want to talk about the difference between getting stopped in a car and somebody coming to your house. So when you think about the car, you have a expectation of privacy in your car. It's your car, right? Like everybody shouldn't just get in your car, but you're driving your car on a public road, right? So the expectation of privacy on a public road is not as much as it would be in your bedroom, right? That makes sense? Like, in my house, it's different than in my car with these windows on a public road. In my house, people can't just walk in my house. So whereas you can be stopped on the street by an officer, in your home, the law affords a higher level of protection. So if an officer is coming to your home, in order to get in your home, they need a search warrant, which means that a judge has to give them permission to just enter your home. Or they need an arrest warrant for a certain type of crime that would allow them to do that and have seen you be in the house. Or there needs to be something called exigent circumstances. Y'all, I feel like this is like 6 weeks of law school and 50 minutes. So I know I'm not giving y'all the level of detail that you may want. But when we talk about exigent circumstances, you're talking about a situation where an officer needs to follow someone into a house in order to stop something significant, like the destruction of evidence. So imagine you were at a traffic stop, somebody runs away from that traffic stop, and the officers are chasing them. You don't want that to be me because I'm not catching them. But you know what I'm saying? Like the officers are chasing them, they're running behind them, and they see this person run into a house, right? And the officer saw the person had, I don't know, all these drugs on them when they was running or something. The officer might follow them into the house without the search warrant because there could be the destruction of the evidence. That doesn't give them a right to search the whole home, but it will give them the right to stop the individual who was running. Or let's say a better example is this person is running with a gun, right? And they're running into a house with a gun. The officer don't get to the door of the house and be like, uh-oh, let me stop, right? The officer has to follow the person in even without that search warrant. Alternatively, let's say an officer just I think they got drugs in the house. They might even have enough to get the search warrant, but they don't have the search warrant. They can't just go in somebody's house and start looking around because they had enough. They have to go through the process. Because under our legal system, there is a higher expectation of privacy in homes than any other place. All right, y'all, I'm going to stop here because there is so much And I want to give you all an opportunity to ask some questions. Let's talk through, because we're done at 5, right? Yeah. So I want to give you an opportunity to ask some
Let
questions.
me just say a quick one.
Uh-huh.
You just did. So they're running, and if someone runs into a house, it's not their house, and the owner is at the door, then the police can just knock that owner aside and keep on moving?
It depends on what it is. So if they had a gun in their hand and they were running in the house, yeah, right? I mean, again, every one of these scenarios under the law is a case-by-case analysis based on the facts. So I'm giving you all very general discussions for the purposes of this conversation. But short answer, yeah. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
So say like, if I was in a situation, or like I was like, like say I was in a car or something, where like I got pulled over, or like I got pulled over, or I'm a passenger, and like if the officers stopping me or me and someone else were like being, like they were pushing it a lot, like when's the line? Like when can I like be like, no, with that? If like they were, if something
You
like.
mean if you're the passenger and they're doing something to the driver?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. What is the line? So
Yeah.
This is a very complicated subject. I'm gonna try to give you the simplest version of it, and we can talk about it more after time if you want to. Here's the short version. In general, getting involved in an officer interaction that is happening is not the thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
If, let's say you saw an officer who was, I don't even know a good example to use, but it was completely obvious that they were just abusing someone, right? The law as it relates to self-defense or the defense of others, it's the same for us and officers.
Mm-hmm.
So there will be some space in the law where maybe that's acceptable,
Okay.
but it's so difficult to articulate an example of when that would happen.
Mm-hmm.
In general, it's not the best course of action. The best
Okay.
course of action is to record, to call for additional assistance, right?
Okay.
Or those types of things. I mean, there's a line where it'll be clear to us. It's just difficult to articulate.
Like if it was a situation like the one that you mentioned at the beginning though.
Yes.
Like if you said you had a passenger in your car whenever you were pulled out.
I think it would have been unwise for her to get out the car or try to, I mean, she got put out the car too, but like, I think it would have been unwise for her to try to get involved in that space.
Okay.
Because the officers articulated why they did what they did, right? I think it's bogus. And, I know it's bogus. And I'm very clear that it was a violation of the law. But had she gotten involved, nothing positive would have came as a result of it. They would have done the same thing to her.
Right.
In that moment, right? So it's one of those spaces where, like, it's difficult to give you a great answer. There is not a bright line rule related to it. It's not like the law says, at this point, you can act. If it would be legal self-defense, then it probably is legal self-defense. But if the officer's acting lawfully, but it looks really bad, it wouldn't be legal self-defense. Do you get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And then those questions are still questions for juries. So you may end up charged with a crime, and then you're arguing to a jury why this was self-defense, and the jury may or may not believe that. Again, those are those calculated decisions we make. I don't tell you what decisions to make. If it's Brandon, it is very unlikely that I'm going to be physically getting involved in a situation. It would have to be exceptionally, extremely clear to me that the officer was abusing somebody and it went well beyond, because the legal consequences are grave and that can hurt them and me.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Okay, well, we're at time. Thank y'all so much for the opportunity to come in. I'm excited I got to be a part of Unlearn Week. I didn't even know it was Unlearn Week at first, so I'm excited about it. But thank you for having me. If you all have any questions, please reach out to us at opa@grcity.us. Also, check out our swag table in the back for some more information. We'd love to talk to you more about these things. Here's the big takeaway I want you to know, is that we wanted you to understand your rights. We're not telling you what to do with them. We also are not trying to paint a picture that all police officers are bad, because they are not. But we do want you to understand that knowing your rights allows you to make decisions about what you do and keep yourself safe and others as well. All right? Thank y'all so much.